The dreadful business of the Abernetty family. It was in the year of 97, a period which my friend Sherlock Holmes was later to describe as the era of the singular monograph, owing to his intensive labours upon a treatise which traced the influence of a trade upon the hand, that the dreadful business of the Abernetty family first came to our attention. The autumn had been a particularly languid one. A perpetual miasma, the colour of pea soup, had clung to the roofs of Baker Street for weeks on end, and the ceaseless drip of moisture from the eaves had done little to improve my companion's already sombre mood. He had passed the days alternating between scratching out chemical formulae, scraping upon his Stradivarius, and staring out into the gloom, with an expression of such profound ennui that I had begun to fear for his active and brilliant mind, which, like a master engine, would tear itself to pieces if not connected to the work for which it was built. "Watson, I am undone by this inactivity," he declared one Tuesday morning, flinging down the Daily Telegraph with a groan. "There is no food for the brain in this modern world. The criminal classes have lost all enterprise and originality. I have perused the morning papers in vain. A clumsy jewel theft in Mayfair, a drunken brawl in Stepney, a confidence trickster of the most elementary order. It is a catalogue of ineptitude. Is there no one left in London capable of planning a crime of nuance, of subtlety?" He sprang from his chair and began to pace the familiar worn track in our hearthrug. His tall, gaunt frame was electric with a restless energy that had no outlet. "If you are in search of a problem, Holmes," I said, looking up from my own paper, "you might find one here. It is a small paragraph under the heading of Provincial Notes, but the wording is peculiar." He snatched the paper from my hand, his keen grey eyes lighting up with a flicker of interest. I indicated the passage. "It concerns the death of a gentleman in Sussex," I explained. "Mr. Cornelius Abernetty, of Blackwood Grange, near the village of Hurstead. He was a man of considerable wealth and reclusive habits. He passed away in his sleep, apparently from natural causes, at the advanced age of 78. The peculiar thing is the final sentence. It reads, 'Local sentiment is much agitated, as this event follows a sequence of misfortunes that have given the Abernetty family a most unenviable notoriety. It is hoped that the late Mr. Abernetty's passing may bring this unhappy chapter to a close.'" Holmes read the paragraph twice, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Unenviable notoriety, a sequence of misfortunes," he murmured, rolling the phrases on his tongue as a connoisseur might savour a rare vintage. "The phrasing is indeed suggestive, my dear Watson. It speaks of something more than the ordinary course of human sorrow. It hints at a pattern, a lingering shadow that the journalist, for fear of libel, dares not define. And yet, what is the problem? An old man dies in his bed. The law, I fancy, will not trouble itself further." He tossed the paper aside, and his brief spark of interest seemed to die with the action. But I knew my friend's methods. The seed had been planted. His mind, starved for stimulus, would not let such a tantalizing ambiguity lie fallow. For 2 days, however, nothing more was said upon the matter. Holmes immersed himself in a particularly noxious chemical experiment which filled our lodgings with the odour of burnt almonds, and I was left to my medical journals. It was on the 3rd day that a card was brought up by our page, Billy. It bore the name of Mr. Cecil T. Davenport, solicitor at law, of the firm Davenport, Finch and Davenport, with an address in Chancery Lane. "A solicitor, Watson," Holmes remarked, wiping a chemical stain from his finger. "Now, the business of a solicitor is the business of human life itself. Let us see what Mr. Davenport has to say." Our visitor was a man of middle years, with a round, honest face, spectacles perched upon a somewhat florid nose, and a general air of bewildered distress. He clutched a leather portfolio as though it were a life raft in a turbulent sea. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, blinking in the gaslight. "The same, sir. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray be seated. You seem agitated. I perceive that you have travelled here by the Underground Railway from a station on the District Line, and that you have been in some haste." Mr. Davenport stared. "Good heavens, how could you know that? I did indeed take the train from Temple." "The small smudge of greyish clay upon the toe of your left boot is characteristic of the soil in that particular area of excavation. As for your haste, it is evident from the manner in which your tie is slightly askew, and the fact that you have buttoned your waistcoat incorrectly by one button. A man in your profession, a model of precision, would only make such an error under conditions of considerable stress. What is it that has so disturbed you?" Our client sank into the armchair Holmes had indicated, placing his portfolio upon his knees. "It is the Abernetty family, Mr. Holmes. I see from the papers that you sometimes take an interest in matters which lie outside the immediate purview of the police." Holmes leaned back, a gleam in his eye. "The name seems familiar. A recent death in Sussex, if I'm not mistaken." "Precisely. I am the executor of the late Mr. Cornelius Abernetty's will. It is a dreadful business, sir, a truly dreadful business. I'm at my wit's end, and frankly, I'm beginning to feel a sense of profound personal fear." "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Davenport," said Holmes, steepling his fingers. "Tell us everything." "The Abernettys," the solicitor began, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief, "were never a happy family. Cornelius was a tyrant. He made his fortune in the East India trade, and he ruled his family as he might have ruled a subjugated province, with an iron fist and a heart of stone. His wife, a timid creature, passed away years ago. He was left with 2 children, a son, Thomas, and a daughter, Clara. Thomas was a disappointment to him, a man of artistic temperament with no head for business. Clara was a strange, ethereal girl, prone to melancholia. They lived in that gloomy house, Blackwood Grange, more as prisoners than as family. 4 months ago, the first misfortune, as the papers so delicately put it, occurred. Thomas Abernetty, who was a keen, but, I'm told, an incautious yachtsman, was drowned in the Channel. His boat was found capsized after a sudden squall. It was deemed a tragic accident. "And you have reason to doubt this?" Holmes interjected. "At the time, no. But in light of what followed, 2 months ago, Miss Clara Abernetty fell from the Widow's Walk atop the Grange. She had been fond of watching the sea from that high vantage. The coroner's jury brought in a verdict of accidental death, though some of the servants whispered of suicide. The girl had become increasingly withdrawn after her brother's death. So, a son and a daughter lost within 2 months, Holmes mused, and now the father dies. What is so dreadful about an old man dying in his sleep after such sorrow?" "Because of the will, Mr. Holmes." Mr. Davenport leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Cornelius Abernetty was a man of immense wealth. His will, which I drafted myself, was simple. His fortune was to be divided equally between his two children. However, a codicil was added some years ago, a most peculiar clause. It stated that should both of his children predecease him without issue, the entire Abernetty fortune would pass, not to some distant relative, but to a Mr. and Mrs. Smith. "Smith?" I exclaimed. "The name is not uncommon." "Precisely, Doctor, that is the point. Mr. Abernetty met them on a sea voyage from India many years ago. He described them as the only truly honest souls he had ever encountered. He had lost touch with them, had no address, no particulars, save for their names, John and Mary Smith, and the fact that they had once spoken of settling in Australia. The codicil was a romantic whim, a gesture. The chances of it ever coming into effect were astronomical. And yet it has. With Thomas and Clara both dead, the entire estate, barring a small annuity to a housekeeper, now belongs to these phantoms, these unfindable Smiths." Holmes was sitting bolt upright now, his face a mask of intense concentration. "And if these Smiths cannot be found? Then, after a period of 7 years, the fortune reverts to the Crown. There is no one else, no other family. But that is not what frightens me, Mr. Holmes. It is the manner of the old man's death. I understood it was from natural causes. So the doctor certified, a failure of the heart. But I was there, Mr. Holmes, at the Grange the morning he was found. I was there to discuss the estate after the death of his daughter. The housekeeper, Mrs. Allen, discovered him. He was lying in his bed looking peaceful, she said. But on the floor, by his bedside table, was a small overturned flask of cut glass. And the room, sir, the room smelled faintly of almonds. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. The significance of the scent was not lost on either of us. "Prussic acid," Holmes said softly. "The local doctor dismissed it," Davenport continued, his voice trembling. "He said the old man used a pungent liniment for his rheumatism, and that must have been the source. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of foul play. He signed the certificate. But I know, Mr. Holmes, I feel it in my bones, that Cornelius Abernetty was murdered. And I believe his children were murdered before him. Someone has systematically eliminated the Abernetty family to prevent them from inheriting." "A fascinating hypothesis," said Holmes, his eyes shining. "But your logic is flawed. You suggest a murderer has wiped out the entire line of inheritance. But to what end? By your own account, the fortune now goes to the undiscoverable Smiths, or to the Crown. Who benefits from such a crime?" "I do not know," cried the solicitor. "That is the horror of it. It is a crime without a motive, a puzzle without a solution. I've spoken to the local constabulary, but they are country folk. They see only a string of tragedies. They pat my shoulder and tell me not to trouble my head. But I am troubled, Mr. Holmes. I am responsible for this estate. And I fear that the dreadful business of the Abernetty family is not yet over." "You have done well to come to me, Mr. Davenport," said Holmes, rising from his chair. "The case presents some features of the most singular interest. Watson and I will take the first train to Sussex in the morning. We shall see for ourselves this house of misfortune, this Blackwood Grange." The journey to Sussex the following day did little to dispel the gloom that the solicitor's story had cast over us. We alighted at a small country station and secured a trap to take us the remaining miles to Blackwood Grange. The countryside, which in summer must have been a rolling panorama of green hills and pleasant woods, was now cloaked in the melancholy garb of late autumn. The trees were skeletal, the fields were sodden, and a persistent chilling drizzle accompanied us on our way. The Grange itself was a formidable structure, a dark pile of Tudor brick and stone, half covered in ivy that seemed to suck the very life from its walls. It stood upon a slight eminence, commanding a view of the grey and turbulent English Channel. A high, crumbling wall surrounded the estate, and the iron gates, wrought into the shape of menacing gargoyles, groaned in protest as our driver swung them open. "A cheerful-looking spot," I remarked with a shiver. "It has a character of its own, Watson," Holmes replied, his gaze sweeping over the facade of the house. "A character of age, of decay, and of secrets. Note the new slates on the eastern wing, an incongruous patch of modernity upon a face of ancient sorrow. And there, that high balcony with the iron railing, that would be the widow's walk from which the unfortunate Miss Clara met her end." We were met at the heavy oak door by the housekeeper, Mrs. Allen, a woman whose face seemed to be a permanent mask of anxiety. She was tall and thin, dressed in stark black, and she wrung her hands ceaselessly as she showed us into a vast, cold drawing-room. The furniture was shrouded in dust sheets, and the air was thick with the scent of damp and disuse. "Mr. Davenport sent word you were coming, gentlemen," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "I don't know what help you can be. It's the hand of Providence, that's what it is. A curse upon this house." "Curses are the province of the clergy, Mrs. Allen," Holmes said gently. "My work deals with more tangible matters. I should like, if I may, to see the room in which Mr. Cornelius Abernetty passed away." The housekeeper led us up a magnificent creaking staircase, lined with the portraits of stern-faced Abernettys from generations past. Their painted eyes seemed to follow us with a mixture of suspicion and despair. The master bedroom was much as the rest of the house, large, dark and oppressive. A huge four-poster bed dominated the room, its velvet curtains the colour of dried blood. Holmes moved about the room like a hunting dog on the scent, his eyes missing nothing. He examined the carpet with his lens, he tapped upon the wall panelling, he ran his finger along the window-sills. "Mr. Davenport mentioned an overturned flask," he said, turning to Mrs. Allen. "Yes, sir. By the bedside table it was. The doctor took it with him, said it was for the master's liniment." "And the scent of almonds?" The woman's eyes widened. "It was there, sir, faint-like. But the doctor, he said—" "I know what he said," Holmes interrupted. "Did Mr. Abernetty ever speak of his children's deaths?" "He was a hard man, sir, not one for showing grief. After Master Thomas was lost, he locked himself in his study for a week. After Miss Clara, he seemed to crumble. He would just sit in this room for hours, staring out at the sea. He said the sea had taken everything from him. He was a broken man at the end." Holmes made no comment, but continued his silent examination. He paid particular attention to the heavy velvet curtains that flanked the window. He drew them back and forth, peering at the brass rings and the wooden pole from which they were suspended. Finally, he turned his attention to a large ornate wardrobe that stood against the far wall. It was a monstrous piece of mahogany, with carved cherubs and gargoyles leering from its cornices. "Was this wardrobe moved recently, Mrs. Allen?" he asked. "Moved, sir? Good heavens, no. It would take 4 strong men to shift that beast. It has stood in that spot since before I came into service here, and that's 40 years ago." Holmes nodded, a curious, satisfied expression on his face. He thanked the housekeeper and requested that we next be shown the Widow's Walk. We ascended a narrow, winding staircase and emerged onto the roof of the Grange. A low parapet surrounded the flat, lead-lined space, and from here the view of the churning sea and the bleak coastline was uninterrupted. The wind was ferocious, and it tore at our coats, threatening to hurl us from our feet. "It was from here that Miss Clara fell?" Holmes shouted over the gale. "Yes, sir," came Mrs. Allen's faint reply. "She would come up here in all weathers. A strange, sad girl she was." Holmes walked slowly around the perimeter, his eyes fixed upon the ground. He paid little attention to the drop itself, but seemed fascinated by the leaden surface of the roof. He stopped near the small door through which we had emerged and bent down, pointing to something that was, to my eye, entirely invisible. "Watson, you see this?" he asked, his voice sharp with excitement. "I see nothing, Holmes." "Precisely. Or rather, you see an absence of something. The lead here is covered in a fine layer of grime and lichen, accumulated over many years. But here," he traced a small, almost perfect circle with his finger, "the lead is cleaner, a slightly different shade. It is as if a small circular object stood here for a very long time, protecting the surface from the elements, and has only recently been removed. What do you make of that?" Before I could hazard a guess, he had straightened up and was addressing the housekeeper again. "I understand Mr. Thomas Abernetty was a yachtsman. Were his effects returned to the house?" "His sea chest is in his old room, sir. It has not been touched since the day it arrived." We descended once more into the gloomy interior of the house. Thomas Abernetty's room was a brighter, more cheerful space than the rest of the Grange. Maps of the coastline were pinned to the walls, and a handsome telescope on a brass tripod stood by the window, pointing out to sea. In the corner was a sturdy, sea-worn chest. Holmes knelt beside it and lifted the lid. The interior was a jumble of sailors' paraphernalia: coils of rope, a sou'wester hat, a block and tackle, and a variety of tools. Holmes rummaged through the contents with deft fingers, setting aside items one by one. He picked up a small, heavy mallet, its head made of lignum vitae, its handle worn smooth with use. He examined it closely, then placed it on the floor. Then his hand delved deeper and emerged with a small, leather-bound logbook. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing grimmer with each turn. "Listen to this, Watson. The last entry dated the day before he sailed on his final voyage. 'The old man grows more suspicious by the day. He watches me. He watches C. I fear he knows. If he finds out, God help us all. I must get her away from here.' He watches C," I repeated. "That must mean his sister Clara." "Undoubtedly," Holmes murmured, his eyes scanning the page. "Fear, suspicion, a desire to escape. This is not the logbook of a man setting out for a pleasant afternoon sail. This is the testament of a man in desperate straits." He closed the book and replaced it in the chest. His eyes fell once more upon the heavy mallet. He picked it up again, balanced it in his hand, and then, with a sudden movement, he slipped it into the capacious inner pocket of his coat. "I think we have seen enough for one day, Watson," he said. "We shall return to the village inn. I have some telegrams to send and a great deal of thinking to do. The threads of this affair are beginning to draw together, and the pattern they form is of a most sinister and diabolical ingenuity. That evening, as we sat before a crackling fire in the private parlour of the Hursted Arms, Holmes was uncharacteristically silent. He had dispatched his telegrams and now sat enveloped in a cloud of acrid tobacco smoke, his chin upon his chest, his brow furrowed. I knew better than to interrupt him when he was in the grip of a problem, and so I sat with my book, waiting patiently for him to emerge from his profound concentration. At last he stirred. "Watson," he said, "let us review the facts. We have a family destroyed in the space of 4 months. A son drowned, a daughter fallen from a height, a father dead from what appears to be poison. The result is that a vast fortune is left without a clear heir." "Which brings us back to the problem of motive," I said. "Who profits?" "Exactly. Let us consider the players. We have the late Mr. Abernetty, a domestic tyrant. We have the son, Thomas, and the daughter, Clara, who lived in fear of him. And we have the loyal housekeeper, Mrs. Allen. Is there anyone else?" The solicitor mentioned no one. "People are not always what they seem, Watson. Let us construct an alternative hypothesis. Suppose for a moment that the deaths were not the work of some external agent seeking the fortune. Suppose the tragedy was born from within the family itself. Thomas's logbook speaks of fear and the need to get his sister away. Fear of what? Of their father. I fear he knows. Knows what, Watson? Some secret, evidently. A secret that would provoke the wrath of a tyrannical father. A secret shared between brother and sister. What if this secret was a clandestine love affair? Not between them, of course, but involving one of them. What if Clara, the ethereal, melancholic Clara, had found a suitor of whom her father would never approve? It is possible, I admitted. It is more than possible, it is probable. It would explain her withdrawn nature, her sadness. It would explain Thomas's desire to help her escape. Now, let us push the hypothesis further. Suppose the father, Cornelius, discovers this secret. In a fit of rage, he confronts his son. There is a quarrel. Thomas, in his yacht, is not the victim of a squall. He is met at sea. He is silenced. By his own father? I was aghast. The man was a tyrant, Watson. His will was law. Now consider Clara. Her protector, her brother, is gone. She is alone with her monstrous father and her terrible secret. She is desperate. She sees no escape. Perhaps her fall from the widow's walk was not an accident, nor was it suicide in the conventional sense. Perhaps she was driven to it, or even pushed by the man who had already murdered her brother. Holmes, this is monstrous. It is a monstrous business. Now we come to the final act. The old man is alone in his fortress of misery, having destroyed his own children. He is consumed by guilt, or perhaps by fear of discovery. He takes his own life, using a fast-acting poison, and arranges it to look like a natural death. The scent of almonds, the overturned flask, it is the classic signature of self-destruction by one who wishes to avoid a scandal. He fell silent, and for a moment I was almost convinced by the sheer horror of his theory. It was a complete and self-contained tragedy. "But Holmes," I said at last, "if this is true, then our case is at an end. There is no murderer to catch." "That, my dear Watson, is the flaw in an otherwise elegant solution," he replied, a grim smile playing upon his lips. "It is neat, it is logical, but it does not account for all the facts. It does not account for the clean circle upon the leaden roof, nor does it explain one other crucial point which has, I believe, been overlooked. And what is that? The new slates upon the eastern wing of the Grange. Why would a man like Cornelius Abernetty, a man who let the rest of his house fall into decay, suddenly decide to repair one section of his roof? It is an anomaly, Watson, and in our line of work it is the anomalies that lead to the truth. We will return to the Grange tomorrow. I wish to have another look at that monstrous mahogany wardrobe, and I intend to examine the roof of the eastern wing. The following morning brought a reply to one of Holmes's telegrams. He read it with a grunt of satisfaction and tucked it into his pocketbook. "Things are progressing, Watson," was all he would say. When we arrived back at the Grange, we found Mrs. Allen in a state of considerable agitation. "It's the sounds, sir," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "In the night, I heard them again, a sort of scraping, tapping sound, coming from the walls, it seemed." "From which part of the house?" Holmes asked sharply. "From the master's wing, sir. The same sounds I used to hear when the old master was alive. He always said it was rats, but I've never seen a rat in this house." Holmes's interest was visibly piqued. "Lead the way, Mrs. Allen. We are going to inspect Mr. Abernetty's wardrobe once more." Back in the dead man's room, Holmes did not waste a moment. He went directly to the mahogany behemoth and began to run his hands over its intricately carved surface. He paid no attention to the doors, but focused on the heavy panels at the side. "Watson, bring a lamp. And your ears. Tell me what you hear." He placed his ear against the back of the wardrobe, which stood a few inches from the wall, and began to tap rhythmically upon the panelling inside the bedroom. I listened intently, but could hear nothing but the dull thud of his knuckles on the wood. "Nothing, Holmes." "As I expected? Now, Mrs. Allen, is there a room on the other side of this wall?" "Why, yes, sir. It is the old nursery. It has been locked up for years." "Give me the key." The key was produced, a great rusty thing that looked as though it had not been turned in a generation. The lock protested with a screech, but finally gave way. The nursery was a sad, forgotten place, filled with the ghosts of childhood. A rocking horse stood in one corner, its paint faded and peeling. A doll's house sat in another, covered in a thick shroud of dust. The room was cold and smelled of decay. "Now, Watson," said Holmes, his voice echoing in the stillness, "this is the other side of the bedroom wall. I'm going to tap again. You will go back into the bedroom, stand by the wardrobe, and listen." He began to tap a complex rhythm upon the nursery wall. I returned to the bedroom and stood where he had indicated. And then I heard it. Faintly but unmistakably I could hear the tapping. It was not coming through the wall, but from somewhere else. It sounded hollow, metallic, and it seemed to come from directly behind the wardrobe. Holmes rejoined me, his face alight with the thrill of the chase. "You heard it, Watson?" "Yes, it sounded as if it were coming from within the wardrobe itself." "Not within it, my friend. Behind it. There is a cavity, a priest hole, a secret passage, whatever you wish to call it. It is an old house full of such devices. The sound carries along the passage and emerges through some hidden grille or opening. The scraping and tapping Mrs. Allen has heard is the sound of our quarry at work." "But who, Holmes, and why?" "Patience, Watson. Now for the roof." We made our way to the eastern wing, gaining access to the roof through a dusty attic. Here the slates were indeed new and well maintained. Holmes crawled about on his hands and knees, oblivious to the dirt and the cold. He was examining the point where the roof met the massive central chimney stack. "Aha!" he cried at last, pointing. "What do you see here, Watson?" He was indicating a line of mortar along the base of the chimney. "It looks fresher than the rest," I said. "It is. It has been recently repointed. And see here." He produced his pocket knife and scraped at the mortar. A small, glittering object fell away. He picked it up and held it in the palm of his hand. It was a tiny chip of glass. "A fragment from a flask, I'd wager," he said, his voice grim. "Our murderer is a careful man, but not careful enough. He disposed of his primary tool, but left a trace. He came this way, Watson, across the roof. But why?" He stared up at the towering chimney stack, and then a slow smile spread across his features. "Of course, he breathed. "Of course. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it. It is a masterpiece, Watson, a veritable work of art in crime. The method of poison delivery was so ingenious as to be almost supernatural." He scrambled back from the chimney and stood up, dusting the grime from his knees. "I believe I have all I need. We must lay our trap. Mrs. Allen, I must ask for your complete cooperation. Tonight you will leave the Grange. Go to the inn in the village and say nothing to anyone. Dr. Watson and I will keep a vigil." The housekeeper, now thoroughly terrified, was only too glad to agree. As dusk fell, Holmes and I secreted ourselves in the cold, dark nursery, taking up a position from which we could observe the door to the master bedroom across the hall. Holmes had armed himself with his service revolver, and I had mine close to hand. The hours of waiting passed with agonizing slowness. The old house groaned and creaked around us, and every shadow seemed to hold a lurking menace. It must have been close to 2 in the morning when we heard it. It was not the tapping sound, but a faint, almost imperceptible scrape from the hallway. Holmes touched my arm, a silent command. I saw a thin line of light appear under the door of the master bedroom. Someone had entered with a shrouded lantern. We waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Then we heard another sound, the soft, dragging noise of a heavy object being moved. "Now, Watson," Holmes whispered. We burst from the nursery and across the hall. Holmes flung open the bedroom door. In the centre of the room, a man was on his knees, straining to pull aside the monstrous mahogany wardrobe. A dark lantern on the floor cast a circle of light upon his labours. At the sound of our entry, he sprang to his feet with a snarl of fury and terror, and I saw, to my utter astonishment, that it was Mr. Cecil Davenport, the respectable solicitor from Chancery Lane. But he was not our man. For at that very same moment a figure emerged from the shadows of the four-poster bed, a figure who had evidently been hiding there, waiting. In his hand he held a heavy iron poker. He swung it viciously at the solicitor's head. "Look out!" I cried. Davenport ducked, and the poker whistled past his ear, crashing into the bedpost with a splintering impact. Before the attacker could strike again, Holmes was upon him. My friend was a master of baritsu, and the contest was a short one. A quick feint, a sharp blow, and the poker clattered to the floor. Its wielder was sent sprawling, and Holmes's revolver was pressed firmly against his temple. "I think, sir," Holmes said in a dangerously quiet voice, "that you have some explaining to do." As I lit the lamps, the full tableau was revealed. On the floor, his face pale with shock, was Mr. Davenport. Pinned beneath Holmes was a wiry, sunburnt man with a cruel face and eyes that burned with a desperate hatred. "But who is he?" I gasped. "Allow me to introduce you," said Holmes, hauling the man to his feet. "This is Mr. Smith, the long-lost heir from Australia, or rather one half of that mythical couple." The man, whose name was apparently Smith, glared at us, but said nothing. "And you, Mr. Davenport?" Holmes continued, turning to the trembling solicitor. "Perhaps you would care to explain why you were attempting to move this wardrobe in the dead of night?" Davenport scrambled up, his professional aplomb utterly shattered. I suspected something, Mr. Holmes. After our visit, I thought about what you said, about a secret. I did some digging into the Abernetty family history. I discovered that old Cornelius had a younger brother, Richard, who was disinherited and went to the colonies in disgrace 40 years ago. I began to wonder, what if the Smiths were not strangers at all? What if Smith was the name Richard took? What if he had a son who might have come back to England to see what he could claim of the family fortune? "Capital, Mr. Davenport," Holmes beamed. "Your reasoning does you credit. You suspected our friend Mr. Smith here was Richard's son, and that he had come to the Grange to find something, perhaps a hidden document, a second will, that might restore his line of inheritance." "Yes. I thought he might be using a secret passage. I came here tonight to see if I could find its entrance behind this wardrobe." "And you walked directly into the lion's den," Holmes finished. He turned back to the captive. "Your father, Richard Abernetty, died in poverty, did he not? And you grew up hearing tales of the great fortune that should have been yours. You came to England not as a claimant, but as an avenger. You took a false name and insinuated yourself into this community. You are a keen yachtsman, are you not? And you have some skill as a stonemason and builder, I believe." The man's face was a mask of astonishment. How could you know that?" "My telegram yesterday was to a colleague in the Australian police force. They were most helpful. You worked your passage to England as a sailor. Your skills were precisely what you needed for your diabolical plan. You met the melancholic Clara Abernetty on one of her lonely walks. You wooed her, playing the part of a romantic, mysterious stranger. She fell in love with you. She was your key to the house, your source of information. It was you she was meeting in secret. It was you her brother Thomas discovered. He did not approve, did he? He saw you for what you were, a fortune hunter. He threatened to expose you to his father. So you silenced him. You met him at sea, using your own boat, and under the cover of a squall, you staged his accident. The heavy mallet from his own sea chest was, I suspect, your instrument of murder." "It's a lie," the man snarled. "Is it?" Holmes retorted, reaching into his pocket and producing the very same mallet. "Then perhaps you can explain why a fragment of thread, matching the coarse weave of your seaman's jersey, was caught in a splinter of the wood." Smith stared at the mallet as if it were a venomous snake, and a low moan escaped his lips. "With Thomas gone," Holmes pressed on, his voice like a whip crack, "you turned your attention to Clara. She was now half owner of the fortune, but she was becoming a liability. Perhaps her grief made her unstable. Perhaps she threatened to confess. You could not simply marry her, because the old man was still alive and would disinherit her. So you eliminated her too. You lured her to the widow's walk on a stormy night, and you used this. Holmes walked over to the window and pointed to the heavy velvet curtains. He indicated the thick wooden pole from which they hung. This pole can be unscrewed from its brackets. It is, as you see, about 10 feet long, the perfect tool. You brought it with you to the roof. You laid it down, creating the clean, circular mark I observed on the lead. Then, as the poor girl looked out to sea, you used it as a lever. You placed one end against the parapet and the other against her back. A sharp, sudden push, and she was gone. It was the work of a moment. In the storm and darkness, no one would see. You returned the pole to its place. It was a murder that looked perfectly like an accident. I stared at the curtain pole, my blood running cold at the sheer, cold-blooded ingenuity of the crime. But your masterpiece, Holmes continued, his eyes glittering, was the death of the old man himself. You knew of the secret passages in the house. Clara had no doubt shown them to you. You knew that a passage ran behind this very wall and connected to the chimney stack. It was the perfect route for a silent, invisible assassin. You are a man of some chemical knowledge. Prussic acid is not easily obtained. You procured a small quantity. You ascended to the roof via the eastern wing, which you had previously repaired yourself to ensure a safe foothold and to loosen a stone in the chimney for your purpose. Under the cover of darkness, you opened a flue that led directly down into the old man's bedroom. You poured the poison, held in a glass flask, down the chimney. The fumes, being heavier than air, sank down into the room, emerging from the fireplace. Cornelius Abernetty died in his sleep, breathing in the deadly vapour without ever knowing he was under attack. It was a near-perfect crime. You dropped the flask down the chimney to dispose of it, but in your haste, a small fragment broke off on the masonry. Your one tiny mistake. You had eliminated the entire family, but you had a problem. The will left everything to the non-existent Smiths. You could not claim it. Your plan, I surmise, was to lie low, and then, after a few months, to discover a hidden document, a letter, perhaps a later will, that named you, the long-lost grandson, as the true heir. You have been searching for the perfect hiding place for this forged document, using the secret passages to move about the house at night, making the very noises that so terrified Mrs. Allen. That is what you were doing tonight, when Mr. Davenport so inconveniently interrupted you. Holmes ceased, and in the silence that followed, the wretched man on the floor seemed to shrink in upon himself. His edifice of lies and murder had been demolished brick by brick until he stood exposed in all his villainy. The dreadful business of the Abernetty family was at an end. Smith, or rather Richard Abernetty the younger, was handed over to the Sussex Constabulary, who were now only too willing to listen to my friend's deductions. He was tried, convicted, and ultimately met his end upon the gallows, a fate he had so richly deserved. A few days later, back in the comfortable clutter of our Baker Street rooms, I asked Holmes the question that had been puzzling me. The codicil, Holmes, the one that left the fortune to John and Mary Smith. Was that just a coincidence? Or did our murderer somehow know of it? It was the pivot upon which the entire affair turned, Watson, he replied, loading his clay pipe. He learned of it from Clara. It was a stroke of devilish luck for him. It provided him with a perfect screen. Who would suspect a man of committing a series of murders when the result was to give the inheritance to someone else entirely? It was his greatest protection. He believed that by the time the law had given up searching for the mythical Smiths, his own forged claim would seem a plausible and welcome solution to the disposition of the estate. It was a long and patient game, but he was a long and patient predator. A singular case, Watson, and one which has, I am pleased to say, saved me from the horrors of ennui for at least another week.